Whereas if you're coming from a C# Java background, declaring, defining, and using a variable is something which we do almost every day. All we need to do is define a data type, give it a name, and assign a value. And compiler is going to take care of almost everything. The best part is we already know the what kind of value that variable is going to hold. But the moment I step into the world of JavaScript, in particular web development, I met with a shocker that we don't even have to declare the data type of the variable we are going to define. And the second shocker was usually coming from an object oriented mindset. Whenever we define a variable with a particular data type, it remains same, right? If you're defining an integer value, you cannot assign a string. But in JavaScript, it is totally fine and okay to do that. Compiler will not throw any warning, no error at all. So that was very interesting and intriguing while I was exploring JavaScript. Welcome to the world of JavaScript, guys. In this chapter, we are going to discuss about the variables and data types in JavaScript. If you don't understand this concept, it would be very difficult for you to understand these concepts, which are hoisting, temporal date zone. What is scope in JavaScript? How does where, let, and const behave differently? How memory and execution context work? We have to build the foundation in order to get into the React and Angular thing. So let's begin our journey. Hey everyone, Shubham here, working as a .NET full stack developer for past 8 years, and I'm helping backend developers to understand how web development actually works and want them to transition to a full stack web developer, not just for better salary but better career. Now, the moment you hear the word JavaScript, I've seen a lot of people feel very frustrated, largely because they've not get into the understanding how actually things works behind the scene. I give you the example, right? The integer variable was able to take the string, and that was very surprising. The moment you're coming out of a object-oriented programming language, it becomes so difficult to digest that such kind of things even possible. And the question of why that is happening the way it is happening, does it make any sense? It will definitely gonna make sense the moment I explain you things one by one. So let's start understanding the variables in JavaScript. Let's flip to Visual Studio to get our hands dirty and see how things actually work behind the scenes. Variables in JavaScript is none other than the way we have been defining variables in any programming language. So variables in JavaScript as well is a container that stores value. And there are three different ways we can define a variable using a let keyword, const keyword, where keyword. Let's create three variables using all of these keywords. Let age equals to 20, const salary equals to 50,000, let's say, and where city, not city, maybe let's use integer for the better understanding, equals to 167. Let's try to console each and see how they differ, if at all they differ or not. Now let's try to console this to see if we are going to produce similar result or something different. So let's save this and do node make. And if you see, the values are exactly what we had defined. Now you might be wondering that using let, const, and where, we are getting the same result. So why do we need even three different types of variable? So let's try to understand this in a bigger picture and in perspective. When should you? If you see out here, there are different rules in order to define a variable. You cannot define a variable with capital L and using the let keyword. Let has to be small, either let or const. Capital L for let keyword and capital C for const keyword is completely different in JavaScript. They're not the same. Then you should always start with a letter while declaring a variable. Then can contain digits, that is allowed. It has to be case sensitive. If you are using a small a for age and capital A for age, they are different things. As I already told you about let and const, they are not considered. They're not going to be considered as the same. And descriptive name should be used. These are not always as a rule, but you can say these are recommended ways. In current recommendation, you should always use const unless you are expecting variables to change its value. Say you are defining age equals to 25. You don't have to define the age variable to be integer. You don't have to define the data type of it, which we've already talked about. The JavaScript engine will do the rest of the work and it will actually assign or make this age variable to 25 as a integer. Same for different data types like string, float, boolean. All of them are there, but you should not, I mean, you're not even allowed to give some data type name while declaring those variables. Now let's try to understand static and dynamic typing. Whenever we are using programming languages like C# or Java, they use static typing. So the value which we are going to assign to a particular variable has got to be attached to a particular data type. That is not at all the case with JavaScript, which we have already said, right? If you see, let keyword is allowing an integer to be defined, a string, float, and a boolean. So the type of the value or the type of the variable which we have defined is going to be decided at runtime, not compile time, unlike in the programming language. This is a very important and key feature which you should remember. And there is a very important reason why JavaScript team or JavaScript works the way it is. As we've already discussed about three different ways of declaring a variable, so let's try to briefly understand what it is. So where keyword was introduced in 1995 with the invent of JavaScript, and it has got functional scope. I will be talking about in a greater detail that what is functional scope, what is block scope, what is block scope. So let and const are block scope. What they mean, we'll come to that. The trouble with where is like it can be redeclared, you know, and it is not always wise that you allow a variable be assigned by anyone, either from the function, within the function, or somewhere else. So that was the problem we see in the legacy code. There are some code you will find which might be using this, but from 2022, the JavaScript recommends let and const these two variable type to be defined. Okay, we will. So now I hope things are slightly clear. From 2022, let and const is the de facto way of declaring a variable. Let is block scope and even the constant, but let keyword allows you to reassign the variable which you have defined. But const doesn't. Okay, it is a modern standard one, but the preferred one is const because of its doesn't have ambiguity. You have defined the value and you can trust that value. Now let's flip to Visual Studio and see how they work in action. Let's get our hands dirty again. Since we've already seen using all these three keywords, we can define the same kind of variable that was integer one, which we defined last time, right? Now let's comment these out before we understand them one by one. So in order to understand let keyword, you have to see how the assignment is going to work. That's one part of it. Okay. So let keyword allows you to reassign the value which you have assigned while declaring. So if you see here, let is 10 and it represents a number. Now the same count that is also representing a number, but the value is 20. At the same time, the same count can represent a string, right? Let's try and see what console has to say about our way of being declaring the variables, right? Save it and run node again. Let's clear the console and run again. What do you see? 20. Where are those value gone? That's the problem, right? Because the count has been reassigned to a string, and that will become the de facto value when we are logging it into the console. So type can change with the let keyword, and that's where the ambiguity which I was talking about. Let has also got its own benefit, which we will come to that in later stage. First, let's understand other keywords as well. Let's discuss about const keyword, what JavaScript has to offer when it comes to const. First of all, const is the most recommended way since 2022, you can say, because first of all, it doesn't allow you to reassign the value. Also, in modern JavaScript, that is the best practice, you can say, to use to basically define a variable. Here, if you see, you're trying to assign a value to age constant, 25, and if you now try to update the value to 30, you will immediately get an error. Let me show you by consoling it to the console. Okay, I hope I'm not using age again. Okay, I'm not. So let's clear the console and try to run. You got the error, right? That's what I was talking about. So that was the thing. So const is something which is not reassignable. But here's a very important thing I'm going to show you. That is it really true that const we cannot reassign? Let's talk about it a bit. So as of now, as I just showed you, that const doesn't allow reassignment. There is a one specific condition in which it allows. What is that? Let's talk about it. As we've seen in the code, that const doesn't allow you to reassign. Once you assign a value, you cannot change it, right? But there's a condition which I was talking about is this. If the const variable is an object, then it does allow, right? Earlier it was just a variable, and now it is an object. The name is inside the object. And when you try to reassign a new value, it does allow. And that's where reference type, block scope, and all those things will come to the picture, which we will discuss in greater detail. And that's why I'm telling you these basic concept understanding will help you, literally nail the web world when you're gonna work on the real project. This small misunderstanding can cause a lot of problem and difficulty. Let's understand mutable binding. What happens is when you're defining a variable using a let keyword, the value inside that variable will be first pointing to 25, or for instance, anything which you have initialized with. Now, if you have updated the value, you have reassigned with something else. Now that reference will be pointing to this. Now age is no longer going to point to 25. It's going to point to 30. And now again you have reassigned it with string. That's totally fine. The reason let allowed you all this because using let keyword you can reassign, you can change the value, and type is something which is going to be decided at runtime. So you might have started with 25. You might have initialized with an integer. You might even have made those changes within integer, float, or whatever. But at the last moment, just before the runtime is going to hit, if you have made it to a string, that's totally fine because the variable type is not at all decided at compiling. It has been decided at runtime. The moment the program is going to run, now age is no longer going to be pointing to this or this. It is going to be pointing to this string. And that's exactly when the age variable will become a string. Okay, so it allows reassignment. The value are not locked. The final value will be decided at runtime. Const, on the other hand, the thumb rule is the value has got to be initialized and you cannot reassign a new value once initialized. Now, you cannot declare a const variable like this, const score, and you're not pointing it to any particular value. That is not allowed. It is definitely going to give you a syntax error. And also you cannot reassign the value because assignment to the constant variable is not allowed. You'll get this error. Type these questions. I mean, basically you type it down in the VS Code and see what exactly you're getting. We already have seen that, the error. Now, so let me summarize this again. Let allows you to reassign. You can change the value, and type will be decided at runtime. But on the other hand, const, it must be assigned at the declaration. You have got to give value. It cannot be reassigned. Binding is fixed. before runtime itself. Const locks the variable reference, not the data itself. And that's where this point we will be discussing in greater detail, because understanding this will make things very clear, and that's exactly where you're gonna understand a lot of concepts which makes JavaScript not just more interesting, very important when you are gonna transition from JavaScript to TypeScript and TypeScript to Angular or JavaScript to React. Everything is binded in a very proper order. It's just that we sometimes don't end up understanding in detail. But we are not going to do this in series. In my series, I am going to give you the best. I'll clear all the doubts which I used to have, and I used to spend a lot of time just to understand them. I don't want you guys to waste that much of time. Before we wind this chapter, let me clarify once again. Today, by default, you should be using a const keyword if reassignment is not needed. Only use let if the reassignment is extremely allowed. Age is a perfect example. If let's say you are creating an API where age is a property, then you've got to use something which is reassignable, and that let is the one which will allow you. And there are a lot of different benefits as well, which we will be discussing in the next chapter when we are going to talk about block scope and all. But before we wind up, thank you very much for your overwhelming response, guys. Please continue supporting, and I'm going to make sure that I will give my best to make sure that every concept which I'm discussing gives you a very clear picture, very in-depth clarity. Not just I'm not just gonna skim the surface and give you some random that let and where is this, that. No, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't work like how we, especially when we are working on the real projects. So I'm definitely gonna avoid that. So this question is very common. That can a variable change its type? Yes, in JavaScript it does, because variables are dynamically typed in JavaScript. The attachment of variable to its data type is decided at runtime. So that was a very important question, which you often get, and majority of the people like us coming from object-oriented often miss out on this. In the next episode, we will be discussing about block scope, why var keyword is discouraged and how it behaves differently in different situations. The concept of scope boundary, it is very important, not just for let and const keyword, but also in order to understand hoisting and all, we have to come into the picture. And we will be doing a lot of real hands-on coding part so that we don't leave any stone unturned. Thank you very much, guys. Keep supporting, keep sharing the channel, keep liking, and please make sure to make a small comment in the comment box. Thank you very much. Let's meet you in the next chapter.